Good evening and welcome to Woman. My guest this evening is Gloria Steinem. Gloria is a writer, co-founder and editor of Ms. Magazine, and a member of the advisory board of the National Women's Political Caucus. Gloria, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Gloria, what were you doing and thinking and saying the year The Feminine Mystique came out?
I hate to think. Well, let's see. I was making my living as a freelance writer in New York as a journalist. I understood what made me feel angry and humiliated, but I didn't understand why. I dealt with it just by not ever wanting to write about women's subjects, and I guess I was still flattered when someone said to me, "You write like a man." I would say thank you. And I managed to read the whole book and never consider that it applied to me, because it seemed to me to be addressed to women who were living in the suburbs, who did not have work outside the home, and who were looking for this other identity. Now, I wasn't married, I didn't have kids, I wasn't living in the suburbs, so I thought it didn't apply to me. And it wasn't until several years later, when the women out of the left, out of SDS, out of SNCC, out of many of those groups, began to really talk about feminism in a political way that made it clear that it was something that concerned all women, that they were really talking about a caste system, which was the underlying power structure in the country. And then I finally began to see that it did in fact affect every woman, and me too, in the office, and begin to see the reasons why I had felt angry or humiliated in all these situations, the reasons why I didn't associate with women as a group, because there was a great penalty for doing that. And the best thing to be, of course, was the only woman in a group of men. And also the reasons why I had always felt attracted to and identified with causes of groups not my own, of black groups, of Chicano groups, and so on. Because, I had not before understood that I too was a part of a powerless or less powerful caste, and naturally, therefore, I felt attracted to this kind of coalition, but I certainly hadn't understood it.
When and how was your consciousness raised? I guess what I really want to know is did you have a clique? Maybe we better define clique.
Okay. Well, clique was invented, as far as I know, by Jane O'Reilly in the preview issue of Ms. Magazine in 1972. She wrote a piece called The Housewife's Moment of Truth, and she gave a number of illustrations, such as a woman having piled all kinds of stuff on the stairs for the next person who went upstairs to take upstairs, hearing from her husband, what is all this junk on the stairs? Why don't you take it up? And she thinks to herself, wait a minute, you have two hands. Click, When she finally understands in some way, big or small, that the system is got not to do with justice or biology or anything else, that it's a power system. That's a click. And for me, the first memorable and important one was an abortion speak out in 1968 or 9, when the New York State Legislature had a hearing on the then not yet liberalized abortion law in New York State, to which they invited to testify 14 men and 1 nun. That was their idea of expertise on abortion, 14 men and 1 nun. Okay. So the feminist groups, especially Red Stocking, great radical feminist group to which I will be grateful to my dying day, organized a speak out on abortion, a counter testimony, so that women could speak their true life experience. And there were several hundred women gathered together in a church in New York, and women from the group began to get up and talk about their experience in having been pregnant, needing an abortion, going out and looking for one, risking their lives, even being bargained with. Yes, they could have an abortion if they would be sterilized, or really having to enter a kind of criminal world otherwise. It just extraordinarily moving experiences that you could see these women had never spoken out about in public before. And I had had an abortion many years before and never told anyone, because this was this kind of criminal, shameful act, And then and I began to realize, but wait a minute, you know, if 1 out of 4, or maybe even 1 out of 3 adult women has had an abortion, then why is this an aberration? I mean, why is this, it's our bodies, you know, why is it not our right? And I began to see what, of course, the radical feminists were saying in the first place, which was that, you know, it is a caste problem, and that women are an oppressed group. I mean, women are kind of literally the means of production, which the male in the family or the patriarchal state has to control, and you know, really to see it politically. And then finally I understood that even though I was not married, living in the suburbs, you know, that it was a problem that affected absolutely every woman.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the current economic situation, the kind of depression that we're in, and how you feel it affects the movement.
Well, I think, you know, economic issues, survival issues have always been the main emphasis of the women's movement, no matter how much the press has made it seem that it was about opening doors and lighting cigarettes in order to brush it aside. That has never been the case. Obviously, for most women in this country, the problem is survival. If you consider, to throw in one, you know, statistic for argument's sake, that of all the jobs that pay $15,000 a year or more, 94% are held by white males. That's a pretty effective caste system. with the other 6% left over for all women and for minority men, you really began to see that it's a pretty rough situation, especially for older women. I mean, women over 65 are the single poorest group of people in this country, whatever the race of the woman, and for female-headed families. So it's, you know, it's always been the emphasis, but now, of course, it's even more severe because we get female unemployment going up much, much higher and faster. It's gone up about 40% just in the past 4 or 5 years.
It's gone up, not down?
Female unemployment.
Yes.
Unemployment.
It's gone up.
It's gone up enormously, yeah. And there are at least 2 million and probably more women and kids on welfare just in the past few years. So it's, you know, it really is more and more about survival, and part of what we try to do is educational, you know, to try to make everyone, men and women, understand that women work because they need to work, so that in this depression we won't get what we had in the last depression, which was that women, simply because they were women, were put out of work, and it was assumed that men, just because they were men, needed it more. There are many other kinds of educational, I mean, we tried to figure out, women, especially white women, are always thought not to need the job. So we spent some time at the magazine for an issue we did on money, trying to figure out, to count up statistically all the women who at this moment could count on being supported by a man or by the man's money until the woman's death, versus all the men who had at this moment enough money to survive until their death. And of course the men far outnumbered the women. So if you're going to ask somebody, do you really need this job? You know, you really ought to ask a white man. That's who needs it least. But that's not the point, of course, I mean, except for education, because it should be ability to do the job and to represent the population fairly in the jobs and so on. But the educational effort is part of it. Organizing is another part, trying to help us have the self-confidence to understand that it's not our fault. You know, I think that's the first response of many women. If they're fired or chastised in some way or not given a promotion, you know, that somehow it's their fault. But to look at the comparable people in jobs and compare with that rather than comparing to the ideal. To not be afraid to speak out and to question the system. I mean, why should it be why should seniority be the only system that functions in terms of, you know, who retains the jobs? Why should the people with seniority also get the overtime? Doesn't make sense. You know, I mean, why shouldn't we be able to spread the workload out and allow more people to survive? So you know, the strength to understand it's not our fault, to challenge it, and then also information on how to organize effectively inside any kind of structure. I mean, that's much of what all feminist groups do, is much of what the magazine tries to give out in terms of information. And part of that also is forming coalitions. Any time, any really rough economic time is going to increase the problem of trying to turn the outgroups against each other and keep them all fighting each other rather than directing their efforts toward people who really have the power. So we try to stress that very hard in whatever its form, you know, whether it's making it clear that women of all races and minority men are in this thing together, and if we fight each other, we've had it, you know, or whether it's showing that, say, if the students and the faculty, women, both have issues, it's stronger if they get together on those issues and support each other, because the students are the consumers, right? I mean, they, you know, they have some power there. The faculty may be much more cowardly because they are getting salaries, but with each other's support, they can do more, and even more with the women who answer the phones and clean the buildings and, you know, work in the cafeteria and so on, because then you join your issues, and you know that means that instead of just having a strike in the English department, which might not be too crucial, you can see to it that a phone call doesn't go in or out of the campus for a couple of days, and maybe that'll bring results for everybody. So it's that, you know, it's tactical lessons as well.
Sounds like you're talking revolution.
Yeah. Except that that's really too small a word. You know, I mean, I always used to say that.
Yeah.
I always used to say we're talking about revolution. And then I realized that why I was doing it anyway, personally, was to impress my old colleagues of the left, because that was a word they took seriously.
So do you use a different word now?
Well, I tried to think of a bigger word. I would like to know one, because I mean, what they mean when they say revolution is that they're going to take over the army and the radio stations, which is really nothing. I mean, it really doesn't change the basic structure, you know, the caste system that women are after. So now I talk about anthropological revolution, but that sounds too slow. So if you think of a better word, I would really appreciate it.
Well, maybe someone in the viewing audience. What about the employer who uses the excuse that he or she would have to lower the standards for the job in order to employ women?
Well, it's patently crazy. Might be individually true as an exceptional case, but it's certainly not generally true, because women in the labor force at large are better educated than men in the labor force at large by 2 or 3 years. Women have always had to be overqualified for everything they do. So, you know, it's simply not accurate to say, except perhaps in certain professions where women have just not been allowed to have the experience. For instance, a man called me a few months ago and wanted a construction engineer with 5 years of on-site experience. Well, that's very tough. You know, because what woman with a hard hat do you see out there, you know, in the street, you know, with on-site experience? But with those very few exceptions, they're just not. They actually have to lower their standards to hire men. They, you know, if you look at it statistically.
Do you see the economic employment issues as the core issues?
Yes. Oh, yes. I think so. Because a more core issue. Yeah. But I mean, who? If you include it all, I mean, that who gives out the jobs, who has the power to do so, who benefits from the labor, and so on. Yeah.
There is something, though, it's a little bit more basic, and that's image, isn't it? I mean, basically, I think image is the problem. It's image that starts and stops all the other things, I think.
Yeah, well, it's image. I mean, you need enough self-respect to at least say, no, I'm not going to do this, which is sort of, I mean, withdrawing from the system is kind of the at least the, you know, the minimal form of protest, and you do need some self-respect to do that. But after that, I think one thing feeds off the other. You know, you do something successfully, and that helps your image, and then you try a little more next time, and so on. And it really has to do with power. I mean, the sudden, you know, giving of power to a particular person is certainly going to change the image. I mean, it's chickens and eggs.
You once said that the major enemy of sisterhood was women putting each other down and themselves down, actually. Do you still feel that?
Oh yeah, yeah. I would never say that, as some people are fond of saying, mostly men, I think, that women's worst enemy is women. That's not true, because you know, we don't even have the power to be each other's worst enemy. We don't give out the jobs. We don't have the power to discriminate, and so on. But to the enemy of sisterhood among women, certainly, because we just absorb this the idea that our group is inferior, as I had, as I was talking about, you know, and as I think we all have. So we believe it, and we don't want to identify with that group. We want to be the only woman in a group of men, or one of few women. And because we've really come to believe that our group is inferior, just as blacks have done, and Spanish-speaking people, and Jews, and I mean, you know, that's the worst punishment of all. The system finally invades your head.
You and I both had a similar experience recently. We worked with all-women film crews.
It was great.
We have both said, yes, what a terrific experience it was. I spent quite a lot of time afterward trying to analyze exactly why it was so terrific, and, you know, how to make it happen again, actually.
What did you conclude about it? I mean, what was different?
There was a lack of competition. There was none, you know, at all. I think we were very supportive of each other, very respectful of each other's knowledge. I was especially impressed with the technical knowledge of some of the other women on the project.
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing for me, what really knocked me out, because I'm a very non-technical person, whether that's cultural or personal, I'm not too sure, was to see all these women running the cameras, running the sound equipment, you know, just doing it all. I thought that was fantastic. It made me happy just to see it. And then also, it's true, there was a very different, much more cooperative atmosphere. You really do get along better, and there was no natural hierarchy. There was nobody had titles or was insistent upon it. I think it's not always so terrific in women's groups, but when it's not, it's because there's no work involved. You know, when there's expertise and you can actually work together, then I think it does function, and functions much better. Pat Schroeder, who's the congresswoman from Denver, I went out to campaign for her, you know, both times actually, but the last time she was commenting that everybody in her campaign worked together terrific, except she had to invent titles for the men because it made them feel very insecure not to have a title, whereas the women just did what had to be done with or without title.
That's interesting. One of the charges that's very often leveled against the women's movement is that it's imitative. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's inevitable in a sense. That is, both because what we know is the world around us, and because, well, for instance, I mean, the black movement was always, in the beginning, thought to be trying to be middle-class white. I mean, that was the great ideal, you know. And so women are said to, you know, want to be like men, or to have a piece of the pie as in the system as it exists, and so on. But I think that's mostly ego, sort of, well, or just, you know, that's all we know, but what could be better than to be? But also it's partly fear, because it's sort of as if men were saying, suppose they do to us what we've been doing to them. Fortunately, it's not possible for women to be integrated into the system as it exists. There are just too many of us. It is economically, structurally, and every way impossible. But I think we need much more futuristic thinking, theoretical thinking, planning, and so on, about stating what future tactics can be, what future societies, different kinds of societies, would accommodate feminism, which means humanism, of course.
Have you thought about that? Do you have a fantasy or whatever?
Gosh, the most recent, you say fantasy, I mean, I must confess to you, the most recent came out of despair, total despair, because some things have been going on, and regressing and so on. And a friend who understands money, Marlene Krauss, was saying we were hatching jointly this fantasy that what we should do is we should get an army of women and we should invade Saudi Arabia.
Oh, right.
And take it over. I mean, what could be more likely to be freaked out by an army of women than all the Arabs with their feelings about women and so on? Okay. Then we sit on all that oil and we turn to the world and we say, okay, now deal. You want this oil, here's what you do for your, women and oppressed groups and so on. But I think we do need to begin to outline the kinds of societies that would allow the humanist values we're talking about, and beginning at any level. I mean, the family, of course, has always been the microcosm of the state. So, different kinds of family styles and lifestyles are themselves, forging a different kind of society. What kind of structures, what would be the basic values of this society? Whether or not feminism is really fundamentally anti-nationalist, which I think is a possibility, and so on. If anybody is listening to this who is theoretically inclined, I wish that they would begin to think about it, because I think women have a tough time, tough enough, seizing control of our own lives now. It's even tougher for us to think about seizing control of the future, anybody else's future or 100
I don't know
years.
about you, but I'm worried about tomorrow afternoon.
Well, that's as sociologists say, it's a function of class. Planning ahead is a function of class. Poor people plan for Saturday night, rich people plan for 3 generations, and so on. So that's, by that measure, also women are lower class. And we need to counter that, to begin to have the courage to look forward and plan forward. And as a preparation, I suggest that the people who are into this, I mean, not everybody is, but read the male utopians. It removes your humility. I had to reread Plato for research for something, not all of them, but some. And I had read Plato when I was in college with this fantastic awe, oh wow, I'm reading a great book, really profound, And so I read parts over again, and I discovered he's really not very good. I mean, his style is poor, his logic is lacking. And we really need to begin to have the confidence to think forward.
You recently wrote a foreword to Mark Fausto's book, The Male Machine. What do you feel about men's liberation? Do you feel that some men are having second thoughts about the price of power?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're...
We have 1 minute, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Usually you get to women at the end. There are a few men who are beginning to really question from their own self-interest, which is, I think, what makes it healthy, the masculine mystique. It's a prison, even though it's a big, rich, well-lit prison sometimes. It is still a prison. And they are beginning to question that. Not to say to women, let me help you, like a kind of white liberal, but to really look at it from their own self-interested point of view and see the ways in which they have been deprived of their full natures, of their full lives, by this idea of what is and isn't masculine. And Mark is one. I think the book is very good, and I'm glad to see it's been reviewed well by men. I think it depends how it's done. I mean, it can, and what the motive is, because there's a lot of very, it's exactly like the white liberals of the civil rights movement, people who would rather come and say, let me help you, than really change their lives.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. See you next week.